All right, well, thanks a lot. And so I'm from the University of Wyoming, and I just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors, students, and research scientists from the university, and also, how do I make this work, Kristen? Oh, I am. All right, and also the Clean Air Task Force, which has funded a lot of this work. And so what we're looking at here is actually the basin that we're measuring. So this is the top of our mobile lab, about 15 feet high, our mast. This is a well pad, and then we're looking at the Wind River range in the background. There's another mountain range on the other side, so this is kind of a picture of where we're working. So real quickly, everyone in the room probably knows this, but why do we care about methane and VOC leakage? So methane, if you produce power with it, you produce roughly half the CO2 of coal, but if you leak too much of it, then you lose your climate advantage. And this number is highly debated, but maybe we could say something around 3% leakage means you have no immediate climate benefit. You might have a climate benefit longer on, but that's a rough number to start with. Why do we care about these fields that we're measuring in Wyoming? We live in Wyoming. Are we just doing it because we live there? No, these are actually pretty big production basins. So these two fields we're measuring are right next to each other, and they both rank in the top 10 improving reserves. They're number 3 and number 7. And then why do we care about VOCs? Well, interestingly enough, the Upper Green River Basin fields and the Uinta Basin just south of that are both having frequent exceedances of the National Air Quality Standards for ozone. The Upper Green River Basin is now in non-attainment. The Uinta Basin is probably on its way. Although in the good news, the Upper Green River Basin seems to be solving their problem. So how much leakage is there? Well, it depends on where you are, of course, and then how you measure it, it seems. So a couple basins close to us, the Uinta Basin, which is about 200 miles south of the Upper Green River in Utah, was measured at 6 to 12% with flyovers. The DJ Basin in Colorado, maybe 300 miles to the southeast, so again, regionally close, 4% leakage rate was measured there, again with flyovers. These are relevant basins because they're both about the same depth, they're both about similar liquid compositions, so similar kind of basins and recovery techniques. But then if you look at national studies, you get much lower numbers. These are done in a slightly different way. So the Allen et al. Study used a lot more process level measurements. So maybe there's a measurement issue, maybe there's a where you are in the world issue. And then overall, it's been suggested that the emission inventories are a factor of 2 low nationally and maybe 3 to 7 low regionally. And so there's these two questions. How much do basins vary just basin to basin, and how much of this is a measurement issue? So there's many ways you can do these top-down measurements. You can do fluxes from airplanes, you can do ground-based measurements, try to scale them up, or you can actually measure individual valves and do an emission inventory kind of thing. So what do we do? Well, first we took our Wyoming King Air, and this is an NSF platform, so anyone can fly on it, and we threw a Picaro on there. And so we had one shot, we kind of finagled one flight out of our generous aircraft crew. And so we had basically zero confidence this would work because it never works the first time. And so what we did is, so here's one of the mountain ranges. So we're up here in northwest Wyoming. Yellowstone's up here. Everyone always wonders how close we are to Yellowstone. So, and so you have about 4,000 wells in this box. This is our flight path. And so we just made a simple box around it. We did vertical profiles many times down here on the southern edge of the box and the northern edge of the box. And there you go. So in order for our method of flux estimate to work, we need a well-mixed planetary boundary layer. And so we got lucky. We see a nice lapse rate of temperature indicating well-mixed boundary layer. And then we see that the water vapor is pretty well-mixed all the way up to a fairly distinct boundary layer top, where it drops off and gets really dry. Okay, so what do we see? So on the right, you'll see these are, this is indicating the wind, and so you can see that it's fairly constant magnitude and constant direction, so we just got really lucky. This is that same box we just showed on the last map. And then on the left, you see our time series of methane, and so we broke that into, so here if you see a positive number, it's going into the box, a negative number, it's going out of the box. And so we can very clearly see a nice influx region up here in the northwest and an outflow region down here in the southeast. And when we take those regions and we look at the methane, we see very clearly we have a nice enhancement. So we did one flight level at 1,000 feet above ground level, right near ground, and then we did this again at the top of the boundary layer at 10,000 feet above ground level, and we see a similar methane enhancement, same regions of inflow and outflow. The boundary layer barely expanded, so we just got the golden day the first time we went. We got lucky. And one other thing to note is we're taking the background is this area, and it's some of the lowest methane we see in the whole flight, so that's just good to note. And so what do we see? Well, we look up from the Wyoming Oil and Gas Commission how much methane is being produced. And by the way, sometimes people ask about other sources of methane. This is a really remote, desolate region. There's a few cattle, but there's nothing of significance. So we got 57 million, roughly, MCF in June, and when we made our measurements. And so we only have monthly statistics, so we divide that out and assume it's relatively constant. We put in uncertainties, how well we knew our boundary layer height, how well we knew our background methane. We go through on the two boxes, and encouragingly, we get very similar numbers for the two boxes, and surprisingly, our number is about, even if you take the high end, roughly 0.4%. So this is an order of magnitude lower than both the Uinta and the DJ basins nearby. And so the question then is what's going on? So the Uinta Basin is not very regulated at all, but the DJ is quite regulated. And so if you look at how these operate, the DJ and the Wyoming basins are fairly similar. So it's a bit confusing. So we went down to the ground level to try to figure out what was going on. And so what we do is different than what Scott just talked about. So we've taken the EPA's a method that Eben Thoma and colleagues developed. And basically the idea is we transect a facility, so we need to be close to the facility. We can be about 30 to 200 yards away. And we get downwind of it, we see the plume, we identify the plume, and then we sit where we think the plume is. And so here's our mobile lab sitting down there. And we sit there for roughly 20 minutes, and the concept is at any one point in time, you'll just see random eddies and fluxes of methane here. But if you sit there long enough, the wind will slowly shift, everything will average out, and if you take average numbers, you should get a Gaussian plume. And shockingly, you do. I was surprised to see this. This is way too textbook, but that's an actual measurement, and a lot of them look this good. We're also, big caveat, we're in Wyoming where the wind always blows, so that's nice. So here's the stuff that got us turned on to this method. So here's Eben Thoma's paper that was recently published. And so this is something like 150 test measurements, and basically you see the red dots are data quality flags. So if you have what the method thinks is good data, for the most part you're within plus or minus 30% and definitely plus or minus 50%. So we did the same thing in collaboration with CSU. So they were really nice and let us use some of their test facilities, and so we came up and measured methane leak rates, and so the top is actually distance, the bottom axis got cut off, but we can measure from about 30 to 200 meters away, and we can measure from leak rates of about 5 liters per minute all the way up to very large leak rates, and we also seem to be in plus or minus 30%. And maybe our data quality flags are too rigorous, actually. So what do we see when we measure the Upper Green River Basin from a well pad perspective? So this is just well pads that we're looking at now. And basically SWP stands for single well pad, and what we see when we measure single well pads is kind of a shotgun. It doesn't seem to correlate much with production rate. You get leak rates anywhere from almost unmeasurable to 2% of the production. And then the really large emitters, there's only a couple, but they do seem to be at the lower production rates. And then if you look at multi-well pads, you see more of a pattern. You only see the large emissions for the lower production rates, and it really seems to tail off as you get to these really high production rates. And so that's an important factor. So when we look at these statistics, one thing that you have to always keep in mind, you can present statistics pretty much any way you want to get any answer you want. And so we're not measuring infinite wells. We measure 23 single well pads and 20 multi-well pads, although that constitutes 148 actual wells. The Thoma paper that was just published has like 120 more measurements in the same basin, so our numbers agree quite well. And so if you just say the high and low, you can get anywhere from 5, 6, 7% down to almost no leakage. You can do means, you can do medians, but really probably what matters is the mass-weighted average, which is the fraction of leakage divided by the total production. So this is where these multi-well pads that produce a lot of methane really start to drive the number down. And when you do that, for single well pads, you still have quite a bit of leakage, a percent. For multi-well pads, you get very low leakage, 0.14%, and overall we got about 0.2% when we average it all up. Now the statistics are skewed high, and it's not a perfect number, but it's encouraging that from the well pad leak rate we see something like 0.1, 0.2%, and overall in the basin we see 0.25 to 0.4%. These numbers are not in different ballparks. So it's suggesting that the well pads are a significant source of the leakage, and that our overall basin leak rate is not out to lunch. And so we're also measuring VOCs, and so this is something we're actively working on, but just a preview. And so what we're seeing here is methane in the bottom, and VOC measured with a PTR TOF in the top, and this is our high speed, about 2 hertz measurements of both, and they're correlated with wind direction. And just a couple of things to point out. So historically, people have normally taken canisters and then ratioed that to methane, and we just wanted to see if that was valid, and for the most part it looks like it is pretty valid, although we do get some incidents where we have methane with no associated VOC and the ratios are not always constant, so it's complicated, but it doesn't look too horrible. The other thing I wanted to point out is just our emission inventory is really doing the job, and so this is one, we have a FLIR camera so we can nominally tell where these leaks are coming from, and this was very clearly coming from a dehydration unit. And we see here the green bars in the VOC are the highest by quite a bit, and that's toluene. And then we go and we look at our next dehy unit, and we do a lot of these, and now the xylenes are dominant, and sometimes the toluene. So it seems like the emission ratios are varying a lot, even from the same facility, same process type. So that'll be interesting. And in this case, we see the methane to VOC ratio changing quite a bit. So is this multiple sources, et cetera? We're diving into that. So what did we learn? Well, we learned in the Upper Green River Basin, methane emissions appear to be about an order of magnitude lower than their nearby neighbors, despite similar location, reservoir depth, gathering techniques, etc. And then we also learned that you do seem to be able to get some closure doing these facility level measurements with the basin-wide flux measurement. But of course, this fat tail, these large emitters make the statistics difficult. And VOC and methane, they do seem to be linked, but it's a little more complex than it might seem initially. And then just thanks to all our sponsors and co-authors, and that's it.
Thank you, Shane. Do we have any questions? Many.
You didn't say it explicitly, but one of the important factors in doing reconciliation is ensuring that the same time period that you're taking the top-down measurements, or sorry, the top-down measurements that you're going to run on the set, because well pads and oil and gas operations.
Yep.
Was that the case here?
Yeah, I mean, it takes a long time to do the ground measurements, but they're within a few months of each other, so. No, you can't do it the same day. It takes days and days to do the bottom.
Did you have a chance to look at sort of the larger, any of the larger kind of gathering or processing or?
No, so one weakness of our technique that Aerodyne is much better at is if we have too large a facility, it stops looking like a point source, so we can't get that Gaussian plume.
Thank you, Shane.